In this video, we're going to be talking to Dr. Matt Mahmoudi, researcher and advisor for Amnesty Tech. Matt's focus areas are big data, artificial intelligence, and human rights. Digital dehumanization is a process where humans are reduced to data, which is then used to make decisions and/or take actions that negatively affect our lives. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do at Amnesty Tech?
Absolutely. So I'm a researcher and advisor on artificial intelligence and human rights. And basically, I lead up our work on facial recognition technologies and trying to ban them globally by first documenting and exposing how it's being used by states and how it's being developed by corporations, but also in particular paying attention to other artificial intelligence tools that are being used in combination with surveillance by law enforcement agencies, police, etc.
Thank you. And so can you give us a sense about the work that you've been doing with Ban the Scan?
So Ban the Scan is a campaign that was rolled out in early 2021 after it became apparent that facial recognition technologies were being used by law enforcement agencies, both to stifle protests, but also in particular to hone in on and discriminately target, in particular, Black Lives Matter protesters in New York City. This is after Amnesty released policy position that actually there is no version of facial recognition technologies that are compatible with international human rights standards. Again, because they violate your right to privacy, because they violate your right to equality and non-discrimination, and they fundamentally stifle your ability to protest. So the campaign has been looking at the ways in which facial recognition has been used by the New York Police Department, by police in Hyderabad and Telangana state in India, as well as by Israeli authorities against Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories.
Why is the use of facial recognition systems such a particular concern?
So facial recognition systems, by design, depend on the mass scraping and monitoring of people's facial imagery without their knowledge and consent. So you can have a situation in which a company, for example, scrapes the web for various faces, often millions of faces, putting together a database that it then uses to train an algorithm to draw facial comparisons. That technology is then sold off to, for example, law enforcement agencies or other developers that end up using it to identify, for example, protesters or Palestinians in our recent report. So what you end up having is a system that, by design, is built with mass surveillance, never mind how it's actually being deployed in space. So just from that particular fact, we know that it's incompatible with the right to privacy. We also know that more often than not, the technology is being used to target not only protesters, but in particular protesters of color and racialized communities. In New York City, for example, we looked at how facial recognition exposure were asymmetrically more present in communities of color, and in particular communities that were already being targeted by stop and frisk police practices. So we see the ways in which existing discriminatory practices by law enforcement agencies in particular are really reinforced by the usage of this form of AI-driven surveillance, which is why we're saying that the technology, again, is incompatible with international human rights standards and have to be banned. There's no conceivable version of it that can work with human rights.
So the databases that feed these facial recognition systems, can you tell us how they're created?
So the databases that facial recognition technologies are based on are usually scraped without people's knowledge and consent, for example, from their social media profiles or from things such as driver's license registries. Basically, information that are kept in places where the people who originally gave consent to that information to be stored didn't actually give consent for that information to then go on and be used in a mass surveillance systems. Those images are then used by corporations to produce a facial recognition algorithm being trained towards being able to carry out facial comparisons, and then used together with things like CCTV cameras to be able to identify people, for example, when they participate in protests.
How is this not illegal already?
That's a great question. It should be. It's not illegal already, of course, because there is this notion that the technology can be used to generate greater safety. However, there is currently no evidence to show us in any way, shape, or form that facial recognition technologies are reducing crime, which is often the sort of metric that is used by law enforcement agencies as well as by corporations who are developing the tools. Quite the opposite, we see how the technology is being used to stifle people's rights, and it often leads to this sort of erosion of their most basic rights. We talk about the right to privacy in particular and hold it in high esteem because it's kind of a gateway right in many ways. Without the right to privacy, you're being stored in databases in which you could be perpetually virtually lined up in basically a police lineup without your knowledge and consent, We also know that people that end up in these virtual lineups are often Black and brown people, and so we know that there's a racialized element to it. So again, by having your right to privacy violated, you're also having your right to equality and non-discrimination violated. And also, if you know that this is happening to you, you're less likely to participate in protests. So that's your right to freedom of peaceful assembly and your right to freedom of expression that's being fundamentally violated by this technology. So it should be illegal, but it isn't.
So has facial recognition and CCTV actually been proven to reduce crime?
There's currently no data or research to support the idea that facial recognition technologies in any way reduce crime. We already know from Joy Blambini's research earlier on that actually there is fundamental biases within facial recognition tools that in fact end up criminalizing people who were not even involved in a particular crime or case that is being investigated. So we already know that, for example, upwards of 90%, depending on the kind of context that you're looking at, of facial recognition results are actually false positives. So you can end up in a situation where you have someone like Robert Williams of Detroit, who is a Black man who was arrested at 4 a.m. in his home for a crime for which he was not present. He was in his home. Or a situation involving a man from New Jersey who was arrested for a crime that had happened across state borders, again, was not involved. So you end up in situations in which actually, rather than reducing crime, it's creating more work for police departments. You could argue that facial recognition technologies are incurring more of a cost on police departments rather than actually being the sort of cost-saving, efficiency-driving technology that they're hoping for it to be.
So you could say that facial recognition systems doesn't actually improve people's lives directly.
Not in any way. Facial recognition technologies are often being used to put on steroids existing discriminatory practices that exist within institutions, within law enforcement agencies in particular. I mean, there's a reason to why companies came out and actually deployed moratoria on themselves for the development of facial recognition and the sales of it in the immediate aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. This was particularly because there was this knowledge that the technology had a racialized angle, that it targeted racialized communities, and that it had inherent racialized biases too. So yes, I would say that is a correct characterization.
Thank you. So we're often faced with the response that if you've got nothing to hide, these types of technologies shouldn't be of concern. What's your response to that?
So my concern with this question is that it's slightly paradoxical, because it starts with the notion that these technologies are somehow generating greater safety for people. But my first question is, safety for whom? And if it's not protecting their rights, so their right to privacy, their right to equality and non-discrimination, their right to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly, then what is it actually doing? And if it's in fact eroding those rights, then it's not really protecting the safety of the people. And so the second question we should ask is, who's defining whose safety is at risk here? Because it's certainly not the safety of people who are out protesting the murder of George Floyd. It's not the safety of Black and brown people in communities that are targeted by policing. Then whose safety is it for? And if we can't legitimately answer that question, then we should question the premise of the question as well as the premise of the technology altogether, which is why we are of the opinion that technology should be banned.
At our global meeting in Costa Rica, we were told by lots of locals that there's so much CCTV and surveillance that nobody actually knows, including the police and government, who these cameras actually belong to and who has access to them. So can you tell us how secure is surveillance systems, generally speaking?
So all systems are vulnerable, and the systems of surveillance that are deployed by cities are only as safe and secure as the institutions that put them out in the first place. And of course, institutions might find themselves quite vulnerable because for whatever reason they've chosen not to tackle issues that are actually about politics, economics, and sociology with policymaking, but are instead handling it with cost-saving techno-solutionist, as it were, provisions, which oftentimes leads to the kinds of scenarios in which there's kind of a Wild West in which citizens may decide to also roll out counter-surveillance measures. And you might find storefronts filled with facial recognition cameras. And before you know it, you have sort of a hodgepodge of a surveillance city in which nobody really is clear where the data goes or who has control. And of course, in an era in which ultimately the winners of this situation are corporations that gather the data and often teach their algorithms how to do facial recognition better, or whatever that might mean. They're ultimately the ones that are gaining from this situation in which there is no control. Of course, we also have to be attuned to the fact that there is geopolitical vulnerability at the moment, and we cannot be sure what actors might have access to these systems either. So of course there's a great tendency to draw on the sort of national security, national interest argument when you're arguing for the rollout of these technologies in the first place. But by rolling them out, you're exposing yourself to fundamental vulnerabilities that didn't exist prior to the rollout of these technologies. So I really think sort of having a minimalist approach, as it were, to this in the first place is prudent states.
Thank you. In a digitally connected social age, why is privacy important?
Privacy is always important. It's one of our fundamental human rights. And it's really important that it's respected, especially in a connected age, because we're talking about effectively a right that is a gateway right in many ways. Without your right to privacy, for example, as discussed before, you could end up in a situation in which your data is being used to target the community that you're a member of. And that could often be in racializing ways and discriminatory ways by other means. Or you can end up in a situation in which your data has been used and harvested to identify people who are participating in protest, or even to look into people's homes and find out who they are, how they're moving, and why they're doing what they're doing. And so you end up in a situation in which everyday life is mapped out and commodified and datafied in ways that you didn't sign up for. So really, the right to privacy, in many ways, is about having access to your other rights. It's not the only right, and it doesn't matter more than any other rights, but it's crucially important that in this time it's respected, because otherwise we're on a slippery slope to all of our other rights being eroded.
How common is targeted discriminatory surveillance?
It is very common, and it's often a constituent part of how even systems of mass surveillance that are supposed to be indiscriminate are functionally operationalized. So with facial recognition technologies in New York, for example, we looked at the ways in which the technology was being used asymmetrically against Black and brown community members and against Black and brown protesters in particular who were coming out for the Black Lives Matter protest. We looked at how communities that were already over-policed by stop and frisk practices were being exposed to facial recognition technologies at a greater rate than any other community. And we also found in places like the occupied Palestinian territories where facial recognition technologies are used by Israeli authorities against Palestinians, again, a mass surveillance technology, but yet the database consists only of Palestinian faces and is being deployed only at checkpoints that Palestinians frequent. So again, it's targeted and it's discriminatory, and there's a slippery slope there towards targeting particular activists as well, thereby creating a chilling effect that makes it very difficult for other people who are dissenting, who are practicing their international and guaranteed rights, disincentivizing them from doing so.
Could facial recognition technologies ever be compatible with human rights?
There is no version of facial recognition technologies for identification that could be compatible with international human rights standards. So it's important to establish that there are two different forms of facial recognition technologies that we talk about when we talk about facial recognition. One is called one-to-many facial recognition, also known as facial recognition for identification, and one-to-one facial recognition, which is also known as facial recognition for authorization. The latter is the form of facial recognition that you might find on your phone. You've previously consented to and in fact registered your biometrics such that you can unlock your phone. The data is locally stored. It's not compared against a large database. None of that is a concern. Of course, there are other issues related to that. For example, if you lose your phone at a protest, a police officer could turn it towards you and unlock your phone and access your data. However, it's not the technology that we're concerned with when it comes to sort of AI-driven mass surveillance or targeted discriminatory surveillance. Facial recognition for identification, so that's one-to-many facial recognition on the other hand, which is the kind of facial recognition we find on our streets, where CCTV cameras are being hooked up with software that perform large-scale facial recognition. That depends by design on the widespread bulk scraping of people's images without their knowledge and consent. This technology, of course, is also incompatible with the right to equality and non-discrimination. Of course, we've heard about the many different ways in which bias manifests itself in the system, but entertaining for a moment the idea that the technology could be 99.9% accurate in identifying faces. Even in that scenario, we know that the technology is being used in areas around people who are already over-policed, who are already targeted simply for being a member of the Black and brown community, simply for being vulnerable migrant community members, simply for being in areas that have greater rates of poverty. Again, there is a racially discriminatory aspect to how the technology is deployed in the first place, spatially. And that comes back to the institutional biases and the institutional discrimination that exists in the agencies that are allowed to use these technologies in the first place. And so, again, the technology is incompatible with the right to equality and non-discrimination. Once you have those two other elements, which is to say that they've collected all of your data and it's being used in racially discriminatory ways, the only thing that's left is to disincentivize dissent. And so people being stopped from participating in assembly, from participating in protest. And then you have systems that are fundamentally unfair and unjust and cannot be challenged. And we can't tolerate that. So again, there's no version of facial recognition for identification, for mass surveillance, for targeted discriminatory surveillance that we can entertain under international human rights law.
Thank you. I have a quick follow-up question just for myself.
Sure.
So facial recognition for authorization, is that safe? Is that protected? Or do you see examples where that seeps into facial recognition for identification?
Because of the ways in which facial recognition for authorization doesn't speak to a larger database of images of people, and because of the ways in which that imagery is usually a process within which the individual has been involved in the registration process themselves, it doesn't have quite the same human rights risks. But of course, that's not to say that they are non-existent. For example, you may be at a protest, a police officer might grab your phone and then turn it towards you and use your face to unlock it. And so there's systemic vulnerabilities that are introduced into you using those systems in the first place. Of course, there's also issues associated with being compelled to using biometric identification at the border. For example, when you're walking in with your e-passport and you scan it in and your facial capture is taken and compared, but it's compared against an image that's extracted from your passport. Of course, those systems are not always separate. And you could imagine a scenario in which without adequate regulation, without adequate prohibitions on facial recognition for mass surveillance, on facial recognition for identification, you could end up in a scenario in which images taken from you for seemingly benign, though not always, things such as, authorizing you to enter a border or authorizing you to enter a workspace, that data could be stored elsewhere and in fact put together to be used for facial recognition for identification. And there is not necessarily anything in law currently that is preventing that from happening.
Would you say that facial recognition used in this way increases digital dehumanization?
So facial recognition for identification, because of the fact that it's a slippery slope towards the erosion of our most basic rights, and because of the ways it often turns people into numbers and makes games off of them and allows for harassment of racialized communities, is definitely on a path towards digital dehumanization if that boundary hasn't been crossed already. In fact, in our work on the occupied Palestinian territories, we looked at how soldiers were making a game out of tagging as many faces of Palestinians as possible. It's with the Blue Wolf system in which they were compelled to use an app to register people's faces and given rewards for registering the most amount of faces in a week. We also saw with the Red Wolf system how soldiers were similarly incentivized to hold Palestinians at the checkpoint and register their faces so they could be used for facial recognition for the checkpoint in future. A checkpoint which is necessary to pass in order to access medical care, education, work, family life. So I'd say we're there. We've definitely passed the Rubicon, as it were, into digital dehumanization when it concerns facial recognition.
There are increasing reports of remote-controlled gun turrets like the smart shooter system being installed in Hebron, which is an area of focus in your latest report. How do surveillance systems feed into autonomous weapon systems such as this?
So autonomous weapon systems consist of component technologies that we already have experience with in our everyday lives and often in context of policing. Facial recognition is one of them, gait recognition is another, so recognizing people for how they move. You might have systems such as predictive analytics systems that establish probabilities, likelihoods, risks associated with particular groups and their behaviors. Anomaly detection, which detects things that are happening in spaces that are considered by the machine learning algorithm as being out of the ordinary. those all come together to feed into autonomous weapon systems. So you could have something like a smart shooter system. You could have something like a crowd dispersal tool. Or you could have something like a drone that relies on facial recognition at a distance. Of course, these are all remote biometric surveillance tools, so they work at a distance. You could have gait recognition, you could have predictive analytics. All of these tools could come together in informing how this particular weapon makes a decision about who to target. So then suddenly you might find yourself in a situation in which, for example, migrant communities are disincentivized from exercising their right to asylum because they're being intercepted by a drone, which has all of these technologies within it, but also potentially weaponized capabilities. And that's a huge problem. So if we can't accept these technologies, these component technologies in and of themselves in the first place, because of their rights violations, how could we possibly entertain them being put together into autonomous weapon systems?
Thank you, Matt. Is there anything else you'd like to add on the subject?
Over the last few months, there have been a few examples of how corporations have effectively issued letters from industry speaking to their concerns about the rampant and rapid development of AI technologies and calling for a pause on some of it. This is incredibly dangerous because it moves us into a territory in which corporations are effectively arguing for self-regulation. They are the ones to be in charge of the terms on which their products are regulated. We can't accept this. It's very important that we step into the fora of regulation, of governance, which are already tackling issues of AI governance and calling for the strictest possible prohibitions on tools that we already know are only leading to further human rights violations. And it's important that we treat them as technologies that have these rights violations irrespective of the context that they're deployed in. So facial recognition, autonomous weapon systems, predictive analytics, gait recognition, you name it. All of these technologies have the same impacts on communities irrespective of whether they're used in wartime or at times of peace, irrespective of whether they're used at the border or whether they're used in the context of the city. And so it's important that things like the European Union's AI Act, for example, address and apply the prohibitions that it has in place on European citizens as much as it applies it to migrant asylum seekers, as much as it applies it to the military domain, without having a universal approach to understanding when we're drawing a line for something being fundamentally incompatible with human rights. Then really these regulations aren't going far enough. So it's very, very important that we keep pushing on that.
Thank you very much, Matt. So if you want to take action to stop killer robots, the first thing you can do is like, share, and subscribe to these videos. It really helps get us out there. If you want to know more, visit stopkillerrobots.org/take- to sign our petition or contact your political representative.